Sagan. I had a really great reading month this June. I really enjoyed most of the books that I read this month, and I'm really excited to share them with you. So let's get started. First up, I have a couple of French books. The first one is Françoise Sagan's Bonjour, Tristesse. This is a novella that was written in the 50s, published to great scandal, and Sagan was actually only 18 when she wrote it. It's a little bit of autofiction. The main character and Sagan's life overlapped quite a bit, but our main storyline is that our protagonist, Cécile, she's a teenager who lives with her widowed father, who lives his life a bit like a bachelor, and they're in the French Riviera for the summer, and they arrive with one of his girlfriends, and she does not make it through the summer. They break up, and he replaces her with a different girlfriend, and Cécile is not happy about this for a variety of reasons, and she schemes to sort of try to break up her and her father and her father's new girlfriend to a tragic ending, as you might guess. Bonjour, Tristesse, hello, sadness. So it's a very sad ending, but ultimately this is a French novel, which means it's very philosophical, and the characters are representing, you know, the pull between new thoughts of freedom and, you know, do what you want, you know, kind of thing, and the more classic social responsibility, standard social mores line of thinking. So this is Sagan's exploration of that. This is the Heather Lloyd translation, which is more recent. I read the Irene Ashe translation, which was done right after it was initially published, and I don't recommend that one. This is much better. It's more complete. Irene Ashe cut out 100 lines of the story because it was that scandalous. So highly recommend. And then this one also includes another short story by Sagan as well, which is nice. Alrighty, Bonjour, Tristesse. Next up is Consent, which is a memoir written by Vanessa Springora. This is about her, you know, relationship. We're going to use that term quite loosely here, but essentially she was groomed and sexually abused by a 49-year-old very famous French writer when she was only 14 years old, and she's in her early 50s now and has written this. It came out in 2020. And of course, this is an excellent story of how these things happen and what goes on in the mind of a 14-year-old who thinks this is normal or good, and she kind of explains what she was thinking at the time and how her trauma played into it. But also, this is a scathing indictment on French society, because everyone in this girl's life, they knew that she was in a relationship with this man. And they knew he was famous for openly being called a pedophile. He had dozens, if not hundreds, of victims, and everyone, her mother, her father, her multiple medical professionals, her teachers, the police who were sent to investigate this because it was a crime in France at the time, all of them just sort of brushed it off or thought it was maybe a good thing for her because he could help her become successful. Nobody protected her, and if you might be thinking like, how is that possible in the late 80s? Well, if you recall, you know, France today is still harboring Roman Polanski, who should be on trial in the US for raping multiple children, yet the French government is protecting him. So you can kind of imagine the cultural climate in which this kind of thing can happen. What I really love about this book, though, is that you can tell that this woman was meant to be a writer. It's beautifully done. I know we say these things are always beautifully written because it's, you know, we want to bolster up the victims for speaking out, and that's great, but this is actually beautifully written. She is definitely meant to be a writer, and I can't wait to see more from her. Alrighty, on to more world literature. We have The White Girl by Toni Birch. Toni Birch is a super prolific Aboriginal writer. This is just the one that caught my interest and I wanted to pick up first, but I have a feeling I'll be reading more from him. But this is the story, a fictionalized story of this is the fictionalized story of the Stolen Generations in Australia. Stolen Generations was a 100+ year policy that ended in the late 1970s, but essentially the government would regularly remove Aboriginal children from their families for no reason. As you can imagine, this ripped apart families, and it is actually considered genocide. So it was super tragic, and this is a fictionalized account of one woman's quest to prevent that from happening. So our protagonist is Odette Brown. She is the grandmother to Sissy, who she's been raising because her daughter Lila abandoned them when Sissy was only 1 year old, and we're not sure why, but it tears Odette up, but because she's Aboriginal and has no freedom of movement, she can't really do anything to go find her. So she sort of just raises Sissy, and then when Sissy's 13 years old, a new police officer comes to town, replacing our retired police officer, and he decides that Sissy does not belong with her grandmother anymore, and that's because she is very light-skinned. We don't know much about how Lila became pregnant, but we do know that the father is white because Sissy is so light-skinned, and that was during this time period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was the main driver of this policy, is that they wanted to remove light-skinned children to sort of force them into pretending to be white. And that's what this police officer has intended for Sissy, and he is clear about his intentions. And so Odette sets out on a huge journey, very dangerous journey, to try and stop him. It's a beautifully written story. It's a super important subject matter, and I highly recommend it. Alrighty, next we have a Croatian book called The Hotel Tito by Ivana Bodrožić. This is excellent. It is the story of a young girl living through the Croatian War of Independence in the early 90s. She is from Vukovar, which is a border town, and it was one of the first cities to be attacked. Her and her mother and brother leave the city to flee the violence, while her father stays behind, and her and her mother and brother end up living in Zagreb for 10 years, not knowing where their father is, because he was a civilian and he's not registered anywhere, he's not listed as dead or captured, and he hasn't arrived anywhere, so they just kind of are in this limbo and they can't access services, and she basically has to grow up not knowing where he is. And it's very sad, but also it's still coming of age, so she still listens to her rock music and is interested in boys, and it's really quite a beautiful story. Highly recommend it. It's considered one of the best novel of that war, depicting that war fictionally. So highly recommend. And now we're in Brazil with the posthumous memoirs of Brás, Cubas, written by Machado de Assis. He is a very famous Brazilian author who is beloved. And this was actually written in 1881, but it really reads like it could have been written this year. Super modern writing and super, super funny. Our protagonist, he's a dead man writing his memoirs because he wants the world to know his life. And he starts with his death because he wants you to know how he died first, so you're not in suspense. And then he goes back to his birth and goes through his whole life. And because he's dead, he doesn't really care if you're judging him, so he's very honest about all of his thought processes in his decision making, and he is quite an interesting character. So highly recommend this one. Very, very funny, very good read. And now we're in the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville, with Memoirs of a Porcupine by Alain Mabanckou. This is, initially on the back, it says that this is a story of a young boy who's initiated by his father, and he gets an evil double of a porcupine. But actually the story is written by the porcupine, who tells us in the beginning that his master is dead, and he's confused because if his master is dead, he should be dead, but he's not, so he's decided to write this book to let you know about his master's life and what was his downfall. And he is very funny. It's stream of consciousness. It has alternative punctuation and capitalization. Porcupine, you know, he has his own opinions, and he, you know, is sort of doing his job and doing the evil bidding of his master, but also in the end, one of the reasons he's writing this memoir is because he does feel bad about all of the bad things he did. So highly recommend this one. Super fun. Very interesting, lots of different layers to think about. I just finished this one. I'll be thinking about it for a really long time. And now we move into Algeria with the Meursault investigation by Kamel Daoud. Daoud's actually an Algerian journalist who decided to write this as a response to The Stranger. If you don't know, The Stranger is about a Frenchman living in Algeria who ends up embroiled in this trial because he, on a whim, decides to murder an Arab man on the beach one day. It's obviously more complicated than that, but essentially what Daoud does is say, hey, the Arab man was a person, and Camus did not bother to give him anything other than a description of the Arab man and a vague reference to possibly he had a sister who was a prostitute. So what Daoud does is he writes the story of an old man, a journalist coming across an old man in a bar who claims to be the Arab man's brother. And this old man is very traumatized from losing his brother. His mother was traumatized. He was very young when it happened, and he has a very shaky perception, and he's a very unreliable narrator because he was so young and because his mother was so traumatized. But he wants to set the record straight about who this Arab man was. It was his brother. He wants to give him a name. He wants to give the world his story. And really, you know, if you didn't pick up on the fact that The Stranger is actually about the fall of the French Empire, I highly suggest a reread, and then this is an accompaniment, because while Camus' book is excellent, it is a very like Eurocentric story, and of course the Algerian side of, you know, the French occupation is going to be a bit different than Camus' interpretation of it. So highly recommend this. Excellently done. Super, super great. Alrighty, and then probably not coincidentally, I picked up The Postman Always Rings Twice by James M. Cain, which is the book that inspired Camus' The Stranger. In this story, we have a man who ends up involved with a married woman and helping her to commit the murder of her husband. And the postman always rings twice. You know, he gets away with it maybe the first time, but you know, what comes around goes around. And the trial in this is very similar to Camus' trial, so that was the main inspiration. It's a very dark story, but it's very quick-paced and short. So it's a really great read, and it's a crime classic, so very worthwhile. So now I have some library books I want to share with you. The first two I read were Agatha Christie's first Poirot stories. So I had read the Murder on the Orient Express last month, and I enjoyed it enough that I thought, okay, I'll just go through the whole Poirot collection in order. So I read The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which is the story that we're introduced to Poirot with. Hastings decides to go get him to help out with a murder, and then they kind of end up becoming a duo throughout the series, and it was very nice. I enjoyed it. And the same goes for The Murder on the Links, which is the story of a murder that happens on a golf course. And same thing, Poirot and Hastings, do they team up? I think Hastings mostly just watches Poirot do his work, but also very fun, very light summer read. I think I'm going to enjoy the series, so I recommend them. They're classic, what can I say? The next one I have is The Red Virgin, which is a graphic novel I picked up. I didn't love this one. It is the story of Louise Michel, who is a French revolutionary. For about 2 months in 1871, Paris had its own government. They revolted against the French government and created the Commune de Paris, Paris Commune, and instituted extremely radical policies that were based in social welfare, and Louise Michel was a huge part of that. And the story itself is great. Love Louise Michel, why I picked up the book in the first place. But unfortunately, I got more out of her Wikipedia page than the book. It was just framed very awkwardly. It didn't really go into any detail that was substantive enough for me to be engaged, and it was just kind of a bummer because I was really looking forward to it. But definitely read up on Louise Michel. She's awesome. Next up is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. It's the feminist retelling of Ariadne and her brother, the Minotaur, and her perspective of that Greek myth. It's a great feminist retelling. I appreciated the perspective that Jennifer Saint gave us from Ariadne's point of view. The only issue I really had with it was that throughout the whole book, Jennifer Saint continually narrates how unjust living as a woman in ancient Greece was. And don't get me wrong, being a woman in ancient Greece was not fun by any means. It was a very restrictive lifestyle, but these characters are constantly berating their situation, their lives, the men in their lives, and while that's totally valid and you know, you can be angry about it for sure, the complaining about it was very repetitive, and it actually took me out of the story more than it reinforced anything. So I feel like it was really written for like a feminism 101 kind of audience, and it just seemed very excessive to me, and it just kept taking me out of the story, and that's why I just ended up not enjoying the reading experience as much. And now we have Half Blown Rose by Lisa Cross Smith. I was really nervous to pick this one up because Lisa Cross Smith is one of my favorite writers, and this one is marketed as a romance. I don't really typically enjoy romance, and Lisa Cross Smith doesn't typically write romance, so I was very hesitant. But I got this from the library, and I was very surprised and happy to discover that this is not romance at all. I don't know why people keep saying this. I read it as complete literary fiction. It's the story of a woman named Vincent, who she is an artist, and she lives with her husband and finds out through his published work. He publishes a book, she goes to the bookstore, buys it, opens the book, reads it, about how he abandoned his girlfriend and their child back in Ireland when he was 15 years old. She's understandably furious and leaves him, and then goes to Paris, where she lives in her parents' apartment for at least a year and starts up an affair with a younger man. She's 44, he's 24. They have a romance. Yes, there is a romance in the book, but really, to me, it was a statement on how in literary fiction we can have a man go off and have sex with a lot of people, or just a lot of sex with one person, and that's considered him finding himself and thinking deep thoughts while this is all happening. But when women do it, it's always an affair. They end up dying at the end usually. And that was something I found very confusing. A lot of people in the reviews called this an affair and said it made them uncomfortable. This is not an affair. She left her husband. She was clear that the relationship is over. To me, that's not an affair. You're allowed to go off and have another relationship after you end your current relationship. So really, you know, I thought it was almost too obvious. I thought Cross Smith was maybe being really on the nose. Like, she literally named her female character Vincent. I feel like that was super obvious. Like, she is allowing her female character to have this male experience of just having a year and exploring and discovering herself through a romance with someone. I really enjoyed it. It was a super fun read. It's very atmospheric. That's one of the reasons I love Lisa Cross Smith's writing, and I recommend it. It's great. All right, we have Passing by Nella Larson. This is the story of two black women who are light-skinned enough that they could pass as white. So our protagonist, Irene, she does not pass for white. She married a black man. She has children who are dark-skinned. She's happy living her black life. And she one day runs into Claire Kendry, who is someone she knew in her past from the neighborhood but never was close with. And she realizes that Claire Kendry has actually decided to pass as white, marries a very racist man, and is desperately hiding her identity from him. But then upon meeting Irene, she realizes all of a sudden that she needs her community. She needs to feel like she is who she is instead of just being a shell of herself. So they sort of start up this very tenuous relationship, friendship, because Irene never really wanted to be friends with her. She just felt bad for her. And Claire Kendry, the more time she spends with Irene and other black people, the more desperate she becomes to have more and more time in that world, because she realizes that a huge piece of herself is missing. It's a really great exploration on race and community, and I highly recommend it. Alrighty, and last but not least, we have The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, who is a psychiatrist, and he's worked on trauma his whole 30-plus year career. And this is an excellent primer on the biological reality of trauma, the changes it physically makes into the body that we can't ignore anymore. You know, we say, oh, it's all in your head, but yes, it is in your head, it is in your brain. It changes fundamentally how your body operates. Down to sleeping, digestion, your heart rate, things like that, all become altered due to trauma. And so the first half is sort of like an introduction into how the science of it, and then the second half is a discussion of the variety of different treatments that are currently available. So it's excellent. I highly recommend it, but I did have two main issues with it. The first, I just want to let you know, is that the author had a bit of a sexual harassment scandal. I read about it after I read this book, but I reflected and I didn't read anything in the book that sort of flagged to me as misogynistic or problematic in that sense, but just know that going in. And the second thing is that this book really doesn't address neurodivergence. He does sort of at the end say that a lot of people are misdiagnosed as ADHD when really they're just traumatized, but the truth is that in both comorbidities and symptoms, ADHD and autism and trauma have a lot in common. So it was a good point to make, but then he sort of just left it there and didn't continue on that thread, which I found very disappointing because he's a bit anti-medication. He's not totally anti-medication, but he's very strong about it being a Band-Aid, and it is a Band-Aid. But the truth is that for a lot of people, accessing medication is a huge thing, and some of the therapies he goes into depth on and hails as being amazing are not accessible to the average person. So I get it. I'm not, this book isn't for clinicians or patients necessarily. It's really more for society to just understand trauma, and that we need to take it more seriously and fund it, essentially. And that in that sense, it was successful. I avoided reading this for a long time because it was, I was told it would be triggering. It didn't trigger me. The stories are pretty mild. I mean, he does, mention horrific abuse, but it's not described in detail at all. And the chapters are sort of sandwiched in these stories. So a chapter will start kind of like him introducing a case study. He gets into the meat of the chapter, and then he ends it by sort of finishing up the case study. So if you want, you can just skip that part and just read the meat of the chapters, and you'll get just as much out of it as reading the whole thing. So if you're concerned about that, that's my advice. And as clinicians, it's interesting for clinicians, I guess, but I hope most clinicians are aware of most of these therapies, and obviously the science behind them, but apparently not. So highly recommend for everyone. Alrighty, so that's all I have for you today. I really enjoyed at least 13 out of 15 of those books, and I really hope you enjoyed listening to me talk about them. If you want to share what your favorite book of June was, I really want to hear about it. Any recommendations, always welcome. So put it down in the comments below, and until next time, bye!